Welcome to the Westminster Tradition, a podcast with lessons for the public service. My name is Caroline Cruz-Barlow, and joining me today on Wurundjeri land is our very special guest, Eleanor Williams, Managing Director of the Australian Centre for Evaluation, hosted in the Department of Treasury.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. You very kindly agreed to round out our mini-series on evaluation, which started with us telling a slightly mad story about badges. But evaluation, even something as rigorous as an RCT, doesn't need to be as slow and cumbersome as mad as badges. And so it would be lovely to start our session with you today to hear a story about something really cool. So we talked before about some work you've been doing with DUA on responsive RCT trials. I thought, why don't you just tell us about some cool stuff happening?
Yeah, sure thing. And I think, look, we probably do have quite rose-coloured glasses at the Australian Centre for Evaluation because we are surrounded by really high-quality evaluation all the time. But we did have a really great piece of evaluation that we've been working on with the Department of Employment and Workplace Relations that was presented this week at the Australian Conference of Economists.
Woohoo!
And it's basically, the Department of Employment has been very good advocates of high quality evaluation, particularly in this online employment space for quite a long time. And they've had this situation where they had a lot of reviews which said there's things you could do to improve the system, but the suggestions all weren't necessarily highly evidenced yet. So things like turning down mutual obligation requirements, suggesting that might help, providing more career coaching and support, moving people off online services more quickly into what they call provider-based services. And so these all seem like good ideas. But
so it's like that good ideas factory where everyone's like, I can solve your problem if you would just do X and Y.
Absolutely. And you have advocates on either side of the ledger. So some people will say if you turn mutual obligation down,
you'll get worse outcomes.
People will stop looking for jobs. And some people say, no, it creates a whole lot of sludge in the system and it gets in the way of people getting jobs because they don't have time to spend on finding the right job and applying for them sensibly. So that's exactly what DUA's been on a quest to test. They've been running a series of evaluations on various things, and they're very lucky in a lot of ways because they do have this ginormous system in which they can say, all right, we're going to take a cohort out and we're going to test with them. So in this case, the first trial that we presented on is about mutual obligations. And basically what they did over the course of 2025 is they ran 40,000 job seekers through a trial, and that number's really big. And it was aimed to be that big to give the appropriate power because we anticipated lots of people might not want to participate. So there's a really explicit consent process up front. But only 5% of participants opted out up front. So actually most people were perfectly happy to be involved. And what happened is a third of those participants had business as usual, continued on with their standard requirements. The next third had the requirements turned down by 30%, and the next third had it turned down by 50%.
Ooh, wow.
So it's a 3-arm trial trying to understand the different impact. And what we found was effectively a null result, which sometimes people see as, oh, that's a disappointing outcome, but actually in this case it's very, very informative.
That's a lot.
Which is to say, no matter what you do with those mutual obligation requirements, you have about the same employment outcomes.
So interesting. So what are the kind of key enablers for that kind of thing to get off, right? Like is it the tech platform? Is it the large number of clients? Is it leadership? Like how do you get something like that up?
Yeah, all those things, although you don't always need a very high-tech platform. So there's plenty of examples of randomisation that has been done via spreadsheets in a very manual way. But it does help. So in that situation, to run a trial of that scale, it's much easier if you effectively have when people sign on to employment services that they're getting triaged by the IT system. So that's it did take in that situation a bit of investment to get that system up and running.
Interesting. So you actually had to invest a little bit in the IT up front.
Yes, but it also means you can do this over and over again in the future. So if you see other opportunities where you want to make adjustments for particular cohorts, they can now do that in a way that they couldn't before this work had been done. So it's a real boon from a lot of different angles. But also that leadership support's really important. At the time these trials started, Assistant Minister Andrew Lee had the employment portfolio as well, so great champion for randomised trials and the power of continuous learning. So they did have a lot of the enablers in place, and it is great when you're working in a big system that you can play with big numbers and can get good statistical power, and it means you can be very confident in your findings as well. But that's not to say you can't do small and fast and cheap trials. We also have lots of examples of those as well.
And what role does the Australian Centre for Evaluation play in this kind of thing? Like, do you guys come up with ideas? Do you do things yourselves, or do you go and partner with people? Like, what's the model?
The bulk of our work is in partnership, although we do some work that we lead autonomously. In this case, we had someone seconded into Department of Employment. Basically, since we've started, we've had at least one team member seconded over there. And really their role is the catalyst, is the one who to really help coach that team and make sure they know how to run a really high quality trial, because it does take quite a lot of skill and experience to just do all the steps, and even things like getting through ethics approvals and doing pre-analysis plans and all those really important steps in doing this stuff well. If you've done it before, it's much, much easier.
Who is your ethics approval board? Like, where do you go?
Well, ACE has a partnership with the Macquarie University Ethics, but sometimes we might go through IATSIS if it's related to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander programs.
Perfect.
Or if we're working in partnership with the university, we're happy to use their ethics committee if that's their preference as well, because we often have a university involved in some capacity in our work.
And so when you say, like, they're coaching and catalysing inside the department, does that mean the department, like, is your kind of usual mode that the department has a standalone evaluation team that you're working with? Like, is that, and do you think that's kind of the optimum, or, you know, what are the different ways departments do evaluation?
Yeah, so we've got very much a hub and spoke model with our partnerships. So we have formal partnerships in place with employment, education, social services and health. So
they all have great data.
Great data, and have all made significant investments in their own evaluation units. We have partnerships with the 4 big social services departments, and we also do work. We've been doing work with Department of Home Affairs and with Services Australia, and sometimes with external partners as well. So we've also done some work with the Paul Ramsay Foundation and the ACNC, so the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profit Commission.
Ah, yes. What sort of work do you do with non-government partners?
Yeah, so where we see an opportunity to kind of help with their work as well, where it relates to government work. So with the ACNC, we help them run a little trial, helping them get more on-time reporting from charities, because it's a really important thing for us to have good evidence around how charities are performing and what they're doing. And with Paul Ramsay, they've run a program with community organisations running a series of small randomised trials, and we acted particularly helping those organisations to access government data, and particularly linked data that helps do randomised trials well.
Oh, brilliant. Oh, well, now I'm going to, in my day job, hit you up for a range of people who I know are interested in that kind of activity. That's brilliant. So what then? So the Australian Centre for Evaluation is new, like newish. How old are you guys?
Yeah, we started in July 2023. So we're coming up to our 3rd birthday.
I mean, in AI years, that's like, I don't know, 5,000 generations. What is the end game for the Australian Centre for Evaluation?
Yeah, so when we were set up, we were really designed to increase the volume and the quality and the use of evaluation evidence, and that sort of rolls off the tongue, but actually each part of that's really important. So volume, government hasn't probably been doing enough evaluation work, so trying to increase the amount of activity. The quality, we're particularly trying to see how we can do more experimental and quasi-experimental impact evaluations, because they're better at answering the sorts of questions that senior leaders often need, which is my investment leading to the outcomes that I hoped?
Yeah.
And then use, because we do know in terms of evaluation use, we run something called the State of Evaluation Survey, and we know that about 70% of evaluations can point to the decision that they inform. Yeah. And some days I look at that and think, that's really great, that's 70%. Leading to evidence-informed policy. And sometimes I think about the 30%. I think, well, that's really disappointing, isn't it? This huge amount of effort that goes into really understanding how programs work. And it's probably not to say that they don't do anything. They probably contribute to some continuous learning or some program improvement, but they haven't informed a concrete decision. Yeah. And so with finite evaluation capacity, we're really trying to make sure that every bit of investment counts, and all our effort is used into the decision-making process.
Yeah, I've heard you talk before about like how you've been building out the supply side of evaluation, like you're building out that, and this, I guess this is the demand side you're trying to...
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, because that's right. So in supply side, we work with the Australian Public Service Commission, the APSC, on something called the evaluation profession. Yeah. And we have this incredibly fast-growing membership. We've just hit over 7,500 members.
Oh my God, I spoke to you like 2 weeks ago and it was 5,000.
Yes, that's right. That's what it says in the State of Evaluation report. It grows by about 100 people a week.
That's wild.
Yeah, so we know that we've got this huge army of people who are excited about evaluation and doing evaluation work, and now what we really need is to make sure that the full suite. There's a lot of senior leaders across government that everybody's really interested. Like, that's actually a big driver of whether evaluations are useful and used.
Yes, it really is. Because I know you've done a bit of work on that and I'm interested to kind of know more about that demand side. But before we go there, can you just talk us through some of the biggest sins when it comes to evaluation? I'm thinking here about things like bias and kind of confusion about causation and correlation. I am an enthusiastic amateur when it comes to evaluation. What are the biggest mistakes someone like myself might make?
Well, it's interesting. I think a lot of it comes down to how well you've planned from the very start as well. So I think the worst thing, I know an evaluator's worst nightmare is when someone comes to you and says, we've been running this thing for 3 years, we've collected no data, now please tell me if it worked.
Yep.
And there are absolutely ways to work back from there, and there's a lot of literature about how you can do that well. But it's really not as strong as if you sit down on day one and make sure you've documented, ideally using something like a program logic or a theory of change to say, here's the thing we're doing and here's how we expect it to lead to short and medium and long-term outcomes, and working through with someone what are the sort of questions we need to ask to make sure that was true at the end, what data would we need to collect, how would we know, and when are we going to report.
Yeah.
And if you go back to the sort of end state that you're looking for, I always look to the Netherlands, and I'm sure that I dream about this like some kind of evaluator's paradise. But every single time they fund something, they do the work to kind of be very explicit about what they expect to see.
Yeah.
They set a review period, and everything reports back to a parliamentary committee, and then the reporting is all publicly released. So it's a much more transparent system. Yeah. They've also hit the level of maturity where sometimes, according to the Dutch evaluators, you do come up with something which says, look, it's not achieving what we thought, but it's not an instant kind of fail question at that point. Yes. It's not a question of, well, then it's going to be defunded.
Yeah.
Then they get to the point where they say, okay, well, does it need more investment or does it need to be rescoped or what is it that needs to happen? So I think they've hit that level of maturity, which some people talk about sort of safe to fail, where you can talk about where investments haven't led to the expected outcomes, but might still get there if you could make some changes or reinvest.
Yeah, there's a real maturity, as you say, in that kind of not treating everything as a hot button political kind of question. I think one of the things we talked about offline was how sometimes people confuse the cost of evaluation with the cost of doing the thing. Maybe do you want to just talk us through that a little bit in the context maybe of our badges?
Yeah. Yes, I think, I can't remember the exact figure you quoted, but it was a very high figure, but it did absolutely...
40 million pounds.
That included the cost of killing the badges, which is the thing that you were going to do anyway. So I think then sometimes people say, oh, goodness, especially randomised trials are terribly expensive, but it's not the expensive part. The policy initiative is the expensive part.
Yes.
And whether you evaluate or not is a very small decision on top of that. Often, it's a very, very tiny portion of the program cost will be then dedicated to working through whether it worked or not. So I think, that tiny investment is the very important bit because it's the bit that makes the difference about whether did you get to the end of it and find out whether you'd made any change. Yeah. But it is only a tiny portion. And I think if you conflate the two, you can say, well, evaluation's very expensive and not worthwhile. Yes. Yep. Whereas you have to try things in policy. You can't, there's no magic way to get to answers unless you try different things.
That's true. Just from a really practical perspective, for an organisation starting to do a thing and wanting to sit down with an evaluation, like to start to embed that at the beginning, does every APS organisation have an inbuilt evaluation function, or like what should they do?
No, so they don't at the moment. We're seeing that it grows. It's been growing very, very fast. So even across the 2 years of the State of Evaluation Survey, we see a much bigger proportion. So I think at the moment we've got about 34 government agencies, which includes all the big ones, have some kind of in-house evaluation capability. For the smaller units, you still often find there might be a person who's tagged with the responsibility, and that might make sense if you're in a small agency. Often they're less than 200 people. Yeah. And so there's not a lot of space, particularly for a very service-heavy organisation, to invest in a bigger team than that. So ideally you've got an in-house expert, but if you don't, there's still a lot you can do. There are a lot of, you can either make an investment in external advice. You can come to the Australian Centre for Evaluation. We have always sort of said the door's open for light touch evaluation support at any time. Yeah. And we do a lot of this for small agencies, is spending time talking to them about how they might go about setting up an evaluation framework or getting some data collection started. But otherwise, the other sort of untapped potential in Australia, I think, is the academic community, because you do often have someone with a research interest in your area who'd love to work alongside you.
Desperate to have access to that information, right?
Absolutely. And if you were happy for them to publish off the back of some of your evaluation work, then they might very happily work alongside you to help you think about how you might achieve your aims, and then for them to do a bit of work in understanding whether you have or haven't achieved the outcomes you were hoping.
I love that. Although it does require, that one feels like a little bit scarier maybe because of the question of publication, right? I can imagine an agency that's less familiar with doing evaluation might be like, oh, do we want to publish something that might say maybe it didn't work?
Yeah, that can be a real nervousness in government, and it's absolutely understandable. But in a lot of ways, that's the sort of maturity journey you have to get through. And I always think of the work that's happened in the UK to release areas of research interest. So every department in the UK releases information about what areas they're researching. And I know when they brought that requirement in, there was a lot of nervousness. Oh, now we're saying out to the community, here's a bunch of things we don't know and we need to know more about. You know, we're the department with responsibility for street homelessness.
And yet
we still have a lot of questions about what are the drivers and what are the solutions.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that they went through that journey and the sky didn't fall, and now it's just very much part of their bread and butter system.
Yeah.
And so that just happens routinely every year with much less anxiety, but the first year is the hardest. And that's the same
the first year.
Yeah, publishing evaluations. And so we started something called the ACE Evaluation Library, which is hosted on the Australian Policy Observatory, the APO.
Oh, brilliant.
Which is funded by McKinnon. And that at the moment houses, I think, about 160 evaluations. And what we're trying to do is just over time is just gradually build out the amount of evaluations that are publicly available in the hope that makes it easier for the next one and the next one to come out and just turn up on a website.
And be there.
That's right. And once you've got critical mass, you can do a lot of clever things around synthesising across evaluations, understanding patterns, learning from the collection.
So clever. That's very exciting. I imagine you are doing a fair bit of evaluation and data capture on the impact of the Australian Centre for Evaluation. To get a bit meta, maybe it's a good kind of way of talking about how you just set up an evaluation framework for a new thing. How are you guys doing it? What are you evaluating? What are your outcomes metrics? Like, what are you doing?
Yeah. Look, we try to be as transparent as we can. So we put it in the ACE evaluation, our strategy document, which is up on our website. We were a bit lucky, though, because we were modelled on something called the Evaluation Task Force in the UK, and they'd sort of gone ahead of us.
Ah, brilliant.
And so we were able to look at how they were measuring their impact, and largely we've followed their metrics. In some ways, we've lowballed. We had no idea that the evaluation profession would be so big. So if you look at our kind of ambitions around that, we weren't looking for 7,500 members at all. We were looking for very modest growth.
Yeah.
Whereas equally, we sort of thought we might we track how many partnerships we have, we track how many projects we have, and we're going to keep sort of monitoring, looking at that over time, because I think at the start we were just a bit fuzzy. So this is where I know you've got a particular interest in test and learn.
I do.
This is where it's worth, there's a bit in developmental evaluation literature which really talks about this sort of early stages where you're actually going through the process of understanding how you will measure your success, and we felt it would be better to document what we hope to do early, because it's good sort of demonstrating the vulnerability in doing that.
Yeah.
But equally, we'll keep revisiting it and we'll keep updating our strategy over time as well to try and make sure our metrics actually align with what looks like leading practice at the time, rather than what we guessed from day one.
Well, maybe let's talk about developmental evaluation, because you introduced me to this term. I'd never heard of it before. Like, what is it?
Yeah, and look, in some ways it's kind of niche. So there's sometimes we talk about, when we divide up how you talk about evaluation types, we usually go with something like process evaluation, impact evaluation and economic evaluation. And these are the three terms they use in something called the Magenta Book in the UK, which is like the Bible of evaluation over there, but it's a very well-developed resource. Now, developmental is definitely in the process end of these. So it's what you do when you really are in exploratory space. They often get used in place-based initiatives where part of the early stage is about working with the community to understand what sort of change they're hoping to see. So developmental is most helpful in those situations where you're not perfectly concrete about what the initiative is, and therefore you can't be perfectly clear on what you're trying to achieve. So it really has a sort of first stage, which is very much aligned with this test and learn concept, which is where you're really working with all the stakeholders to flush out what you might test.
Yeah.
And then the first stages are testing whether the metrics work and letting them evolve over time. But the important thing to know, and if you read the Magenta books content around test and learn, is that it's very important at some point that you transition into nailing down what you are going to measure. You don't want to get caught in an infinite loop of just thinking about what you might measure and refining and not actually getting to the point where you've said, okay, now we're into the implementation proper and we're going to start measuring for real.
Why is that important?
Because at some point you need to be otherwise you get to the end. And there's plenty of examples of this actually in place-based initiatives where you say, okay, well, we think it's going to take a decade to achieve concrete outcomes. Yeah. But you get to the end of the decade and you never decided. Yeah. So when someone says, well, do you think it was good or not? You've got plenty of stakeholders who say, well, you had a great process, we've built great partnerships, we think there's a lot of positive feeling about these initiatives, but no one can say whether they've achieved anything because the goalposts have never settled.
I love that. And it iterates, it kind of leads perfectly to the question I wanted to ask you about your PhD, where you've been looking at what decision makers want from evaluation. Because I think, why do you have to settle it fundamentally? Because decision makers want an answer, right? There's something that people need some kind of certainty to hang their hat on. So can you talk to us a little bit about what you've heard decision makers value in evaluation?
Yes, although my PhD is a little bit broader. So it's about what decision makers find useful when they're working under time pressure in terms of evidence. So it's particularly looking at the difference, because there's lots written out there about evidence-informed policy or evidence-based policy, which says, it's useful to get lots of different perspectives on a thing, and it's important that you synthesise a lot of different sources. And what I was really trying to get at is to say, and it gets even harder to do that when you're working under time pressure and you can't pick and choose what you've got. But effectively, one of the findings we did have is because in those time-pressured situations, which are very, very common in government, leaders and decision makers really are often looking for certainty and for something that they can say which will feel concrete, and it does lead to a slight preferencing around quantitative findings. They want something which is a killer stat, which can really signal the current status of something. Yeah. But they do ultimately want the story and the narrative that goes with that. Yeah. But the narrative without the stat is not very helpful for them because of that, particularly in crisis situations. You really want that ability to say, well, we've got 40% under control, or we think we only have 2,000 more properties to survey, or something that gives people a sense of the scale and the timeframes and something solid to be sure that progress is being made.
Oh, there's something about that, the crystallising the kind of firm ground on which you can stand and make a decision now. Indy Johar talks a lot about, how do you enable agency? How do you give a decision maker kind of enough certainty to make the next decision, even if it might not be the certainty for the long term, right? This thing right now. That's super interesting. Do you think we're good at providing that mix, or
Well, it's interesting. The evaluation community is probably one of the biggest proponents of mixed methods research, and that's one thing. And in ACE, we try to run all our randomised trials as mixed methods, so there's always a qualitative component. Yeah. There's often criticism of randomised trials, and they just tell you the what happened and can't tell you the why. Yeah. But I think that's not inherent in the design. It's just that you do need to make sure that you do the qualitative work that sits underneath it. And broadly, I would say the evaluation community is pretty good at that. Yeah. However, we're probably not the best at, we could harness a bigger crowd of people if we could try to bring in more of the qualitative researchers and more of the data analysts that already exist out there. Yeah. Because while the evaluation profession is very big, it's not as big as the data profession, which is huge, absolutely huge. I think they're more around that sort of 20,000 mark. So there's all this other expertise out there and information that can go into evaluation work that we could harness as well.
I'm just now trying to think. So your evaluation profession, it's a self-identification, right? So that's fascinating. What causes a data person to think, oh yeah, I'm in the evaluation profession, versus no, I'm just the data wonk doing the thing. That's a fascinating question.
Yeah, and I think it probably does come down to how much we kind of share the good word, because I think the more that we talk to, and we've been out at the Australian Conference of Economists this week, there's also this huge profession around economics who similarly a lot of their work is trying to understand, but I mean they do a lot of the work which is about modelling and forecasting, of trying to understand what something might achieve, and then we seem like the natural counterpart there to say, and then let's actually test whether it did achieve that. And that's the same. There's a lot of data analysts working across government who have an interest. They feel that their work is importantly monitoring how government's tracking.
Yeah.
And so once they draw that connection to evaluation, I think they say, oh, we're all in this together.
I love this. One ring to rule them all, and it's the evaluation ring. So you mentioned before the Magenta book, which I, of course, nerd siren here, fell down the hole of. One of the things I loved about the Magenta book is that it deals with tested learning by putting it in an annex, which is just like such a brilliant public service way of saying, we know we're related to you, but we're not quite sure how we're related to you. Like there's this real sense of kind of... like it's being worked through. That's what it feels like. It feels like a kind of sibling relationship. And the annex is really clear that test and learn, as you said, is not evaluation. It's a way of working that eventually becomes formal evaluation. And it gives us a useful 2x2 to help us think about when you might want to use it. Essentially, it sort of says, like, if you've got strong evidential strength, you probably wouldn't use it because, like, you already know. But where you've got weak evidential strength, but the criticality of the thing you're assuming is really high, that might be a good moment to use it. Do you have any reflections on that, just even that starting framework of kind of when you might look to do test and learn? Do people come and ask you whether they should do test and learn?
I don't think there's much demand in Australia for test and learn yet. It's not. We have had initiatives in Australia which have used this language, so it's not that we haven't. But in terms of what the UK is promoting, it's a pretty new emergent field, so we haven't had a lot of demand for it at the moment. But we do have plenty of inquiries where people come in and say, hey, this is pretty early days. We're not quite sure we've landed what the initiative is going to be yet.
Yeah.
Do you think you can help us at this stage? And I think a lot of what we do in those early stages is try and get them to articulate, particularly in something like a theory of change, is to say, so you're going to do something which is largely meant to, if it's an education initiative, it's meant to engage students in this way, and then you're hoping it'll lead to this and you're hoping it'll lead to this.
Yeah.
And that can sometimes help really focus the attention on the initiative itself to say, okay, so unless this initiative leads to this first step, it won't be the right thing. So it is effectively, I think, the same kind of thinking that's going on, but it's we haven't been badging it so much test and learn yet, but maybe we will.
Well, maybe, or maybe it's unhelpful, right? Like, and I think this is one of the things I'm genuinely curious about is on the demand side. You might have listened, Danielle and I kind of constantly have this argument in the pod about whether leaders want to show that they're experimenting, like whether how, and you used the word vulnerability before, and I think that's kind of like, so I think sometimes it's useful to be vulnerable and say you're testing and learning, but sometimes you want to project a bit more of a sense of confidence or something. So that's like, I'm interested in it as a branding question as much as a kind of utility of the tool question. Any reflections on that?
Yeah, I think the language of experimentation is really problematic in government, and we're stuck with that because we do really promote experimental and quasi-experimental designs, which is just the technical language for what we try to do with impact evaluation. But I do think this idea of experimentation is really problematic, and I think, like, interestingly, I think those trials we're doing with employment, I think they really help people understand, like, you're not talking about something...
taking people and doing something horrible to them and seeing if they die from it.
Yes, or giving someone something that then everyone else is deprived from. So it's also really important. There's this concept of equipoise, which is really important, this idea of, like, it might work, it might not work. And if you're not in that space, and that's what that 2x2 matrix is trying to get at, is if you're in a space where you're very confident a thing works, no need to get all tricky about testing it out again. You can probably try and... employ it faithfully, like try and implement it as intended.
Yeah.
And you should get the outcomes if the evidence is so strong.
Yeah.
But if the evidence is weaker, you really need to focus on making sure that you're double checking it's actually a good initiative before you get all gung ho and roll it out nationwide.
So it's like like there you're almost talking about an ethics, right? Like it's an ethics of experimentation in a way.
Yeah, and it's tricky because ethics is used in a whole lot of different ways in this space as well.
You go.
Well, I think, and there's often concern, like, well, is it ethical? One example I use is often if you talk about running randomised trials in schools,
Yes.
a lot of people will jump straight
They
to
do.
that doesn't feel ethical.
Yes.
But in the UK, where there's the Education Endowment Foundation, which is a really well-funded entity, one of their What Works centres,
Yep.
they had a time where they were running randomised trials in about 50% of government schools.
Yeah.
And they're really just testing things which are, you've got business as usual on one hand and a thing that we think might improve business as usual.
Yeah.
And testing, does this learning method give you a slight edge?
Yeah.
And they're starting to see outcomes. They're starting to see educational outcomes from those constant tweaks to the curriculum and to teaching methods and advice out to schools and principals and teachers.
Yeah.
They're starting to see change. But I think in Australia we're still very much in a question mark of could you even do that here? Is it ethical? And I think it's probably more ethical to test all those things before you roll them out into education systems than to just sort of cross your fingers and hope they will work here.
Yeah.
So I sort of think if we can get to the point where we feel a bit more confident,
Yeah.
but the genuine ethics of it too, making sure you design the trial well, making sure you're very transparent, making sure you get consent all the way, those things will remain important in any research or evaluation setting, regardless of the method you're using.
Well, that's true, but also there's something about, I often think that sometimes we treat fact questions like principles questions, right? So a fact question, does phonics work? Yes, no. We treat it like it's a question of values. Like, is it better for whole language seems to be holistic and blah blah blah. I don't want to pick on a really controversial one, but that is a really controversial one. But I think one thing that seems to me to be really clear is to try and differentiate what you're learning, right? So a lot of I spend a bit of time in the education space, and a lot of the people who kind of really dislike the What Works approach and really dislike the EEF evidence, their values piece is around professional autonomy and how do you value the professional judgment of an educator. And to me that is really important, because I genuinely believe that the interaction between a child and an adult is not a robotic linear thing, right? I don't think anyone who is promoting phonics thinks that either. And so then the question is, that's helpful. So then we can sort of see both what works, and we can see, is it impacting on the professional judgment? Is it impacting on the scope of professional judgment and space that an educator is operating in? And I think sometimes we get so head up in the first part of the debate, we don't think clearly through. You could actually measure some of that stuff as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's really interesting.
And it is, it's a bit of a promotion in some ways for just continuous evaluation work to really think about. Sometimes people who talk about what works say that phrase only works if you say what works in what context and for whom.
Yeah.
And that's right. You do need to trial things here, and particularly taking evidence from overseas. We've got very different systems, and that's not just for education. That's true of our social services and our health systems and our justice systems. They're all incredibly different in their own little ways. So once you take that evidence, it still doesn't mean that you should ignore international evidence. There's a lot of value in testing something you think might work and say, well, look, we've seen it work in the UK. Let's see if it might work in Australia as well, in the way we run our classrooms, in the way our teachers are taught.
Yeah, exactly. I love also, we used some of this in the Badger Control trial episode. Sometimes the evidence really helps you debunk things that people assume will work, like the pregnancy dolls. I just love that as a great example of everyone's like, well, of course it works to give teenage girls pregnancy dolls, and it turns out it doesn't.
Does no. In fact, it might even
be
increase
the other way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Find me somebody to love. But I think that kind of it's holding lightly the idea that you can be informed by evidence, that you are informed by evidence, and you're looking at what's happening in your context. People always find it a bit hard to not go binary on that, don't they?
Yeah, a little bit. And I think there is a lot of humility involved in something that you feel. There's a lot of policy solutions out there with very strong advocates. There's policy entrepreneurs, they call them in the literature, who are out there who are very confident they have a solution which might fix something. Mm-hmm. But, there's so many things that can get in the way, and it's what we see the problem with policy scaling is quite often we see things work on small scale in local areas with a group of passionate people, and they really struggle to expand out and get the same results once you're going broader.
And I think part of that is, that the mechanism of the effect turns out it might be the small group of passionate people or whatever. I really want to just shout out at the moment, in fact, my microphone is haphazardly sitting on it, a book called The Social Edge by Anthony Costello, where he's sort of talking about RCTs largely in the developing world, but then proposes some other ones in the UK where he's based. But it's really that idea of try to build out, he's talking about affinity groups, but try to do some things at scale and see if they work, but hold lightly that you mightn't understand the mechanism by which they're working, but still be interested in the outcomes. So he was doing pregnancy, like groups of women in pregnancy in developing world, and people thought, oh yeah, it's going to work because the women will help seek better, they'll get to hospitals better. That's not actually how it worked to reduce maternal mortality. The women didn't go to hospital more often, but they nevertheless engaged in a whole bunch of preventative behaviours locally in their community that turned out to reduce mortality. So I think that question of how you hold something, how you kind of hold the mechanism lightly, like you have a thought about it, but that you're not so rigidly obsessed with that must be how we scale it or that's how we do it.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people, I would say the development sector is probably leading the way in a lot of ways, both because it's well funded, but also because it's really adopted this idea around how do we bring evidence to scale. And some of the projects that you see rolled out, in India with the population size, things that we see as scaling up in Australia look like just absolutely tiny.
40,000 people.
Yeah, absolutely. Particularly school initiatives. They have, thousands more schools than we do. And so they've learned a lot about how do you roll things out and keep testing and checking and collecting the evidence as you go. So I think we have a lot to learn from the development sector.
I love that. I wondered if you might talk to us a little bit about some work you've been doing with Services Australia. I like it because it gets to this question of kind of common sense, like people assume that they kind of know what's going to happen, and maybe you do or maybe you don't. So do you want to take us through what you've been doing with text messaging?
Yeah, and we are about to release this case study as well, so this will go up on our website soon. With Services Australia, they'd heard from other services that if you send a pre-call SMS, so you basically let people know we are about to call you about your service, you're more likely to pick up. And so they ran it, a really short one. It's a lovely low cost. It was over the course of I think about 5 or 6 weeks. They ran it for about 5,000 phone calls. Yeah. And checked if it did help increase the pickup rate. And it did by about 12%, which is statistically significant and practically significant. Yeah, so actually, if you think about how many, imagine that a friend or loved one was a call taker at Services Australia and the amount of unpicked up calls they have to deal with in a day and how much of their time it wastes. Yeah. The fact that it increases by 12% in a cohort that big is really promising. Yeah. And now the good reason for them to do that is there is a bit of cost behind it. There's a bit of cost in sending bulk SMSs, and you need to set up the test, and you need to spend invest the time and the oversight to make sure those messages are being well delivered. Yes. So it was very sensible for them to say, okay, let's just see how this goes in a smaller cohort, and then if it's working and it's worthwhile and the maths works out, we'll do it across multiple services. And so they're sensibly improving their services as they go. I love that.
I love how fast that is. 5 to 6 weeks is exactly the right time scale for because you can also be thinking about, how would we change our processes to do this and all of that sort of stuff in the background. That's brilliant. Is there anything else you would like our listeners to know about evaluation or to think about evaluation or to feel about evaluation even?
Oh, well, in terms of feeling, absolutely. Well, I think the main thing we always try to present is it's really not, this isn't black magic and it's not rocket science. It really is a super practical set of steps, and we're on a rolling basis trying to improve. We host something called the Evaluation Toolkit. So if you're getting started, we have a lot of resources, templates, guidelines, and increasingly examples of evaluation, how it's been done before and how it's been done well. So if you are overseeing something you think we should really be doing a bit more to make sure we're achieving the outcomes that we hoped, we'd love you to look at our resources, reach out to us, check out some examples of our evaluations on the ACE Evaluation Library. Yeah. Because it really does, I think every public servant wants to make a difference out in the world, and this is how you can make sure that you are.
I love this so much. Look, thank you so much, Eleanor, for coming along. I am pleased to advise you that England won its quarterfinal against Norway 2-1. That puts a time space on this. I have just checked.
Very happy household.
Happy husband, happy life. I understand that you have already declared your Westminster Tradition mug to the Treasury Register of Interest, so I'm pleased to hear that. We are delighted to have you on the show. We look forward to hearing more about your work. And everyone, I really recommend going and looking at the Australian Centre for Evaluation website. There's so much interesting stuff on there. I just absolutely love digging in. Till next time.
Thanks so much for having me.
Brilliant. Just some appropriately bureaucratic disclaimers. While we've tried to be as thorough in our research as busy full-time jobs and lives allow, we definitely don't guarantee that we've got all the details right. Please feel free to email us corrections, episode suggestions or anything else at thewestminstertraditionpod@gmail.com. Thanks to Pampot Audio for our intro and outro music. Till next time.